It's Varma, thank you so much for being our guest. A lot of strategic challenges for Western democracies, let's call them like that, or democracies, whatever that means. What would you pinpoint like the main challenges in 2024 as this super election year we're having in the world?
Thank you so much for having me. You're right, there are many challenges, and I would say many challenges to our democratic infrastructures. We know about disinformation, and we know how disinformation campaigns from a variety of actors really target the resilience of our institutions, but also of our populations. And I think that's important in terms of the responses that we're getting from institutions. I think the institutional part is crucial, but making sure that you stay connected to citizens and that you keep citizens' trust is going to be the biggest challenge for me. Word
trust and word mistrust has been here for a couple of years now. If we look at election cycles globally, 2016 was kind of a year when things fell apart or showed us that some things are wrong, you know, depending how you frame them. Why didn't we learn anything? Because now we see in the States, for example, probable next new or old president could be or would be or will be Donald Trump. And the sentiment we are getting ahead of EU elections in June is that right wing is gaining more and more ground. So talking about system, talking about resilient institutions of democracy, why didn't we learn anything in this last 8 years, or did we, or what's going on?
I think the response that we have to provide as democratic institutions are very hard, precisely because non-democratic actors, or at least our rivals, are using all the weaknesses of our institutions, of our lack of resilience, to make sure that their disinformation campaigns spread. And so the response that we're providing in a way, which I think is still important to counter the narrative, somehow is just always one step behind. They're a lot more offensive than we are. And as democratic institutions, there's a big question for us in terms of how do we differentiate between public diplomacy and propaganda. And I think that is also a big key issue, honestly, that we haven't found an answer to, because we are supposed to counter the narrative. We're supposed to demonstrate that they're spreading lies, that they're spreading disinformation. We're supposed to provide data points, to provide figures that people will trust. But we have in front of us people who don't follow these rules at all, who come up with fairly simple but, you know, relatable narratives that people want to believe. They really make sure that they immediately go to the prejudices that we have, and they provide data points that people want to believe. And they're unfortunately extremely effective, and we are not being as effective. Democratic institutions, EU institutions, member states inside the European Union, we are not supposed to do propaganda, but we still have to fight against these really malign actors. And I think the contradiction between the two, how can we use our democratic strength to fight against the weaknesses that they're looking at, is one answer that we haven't found in a proper manner. Also because there are many differences between EU member states and in the institutions as well. Some want to regulate content on the internet, others don't want to regulate it so much. Now there's actually a European directive for it, but you see countries in Northern Europe who are more liberal in terms of moderation, other countries, sometimes to Central and Eastern European countries, who want to control a bit more. But because there's not a common view, it's also hard to move forward on this. And once again, moderation, I think, is important, but it comes one step after most of the damage has already been done. And so this is something that we're still fighting against. The Russian threat is the largest one. But to be honest, the Chinese threat on disinformation is also very present. And if you look at the 2018 EU Action Plan on Disinformation, Russia was cited as the greatest threat. And the relationship at the time between the EU and China was quite different. The COVID crisis was one moment where really you saw both Russian and Chinese action inside the European Union, outside the European Union, being extremely effective. Both Russian and Chinese disinformation in Serbia, for instance, really insisted that they were the first to provide the vaccines, which was not true, that the EU had not provided any vaccines. Actually, in reality, in Serbia, the EU was by far the first vaccine provider in the midst of the crisis. And it's true that there's a responsibility on the part of EU institutions to not be able to make that message come across, to not make that message clear, to not make it obvious, evident that of course Europeans are helping Europeans more than the Russian and the Chinese are. And as I said, I feel like we're a bit a step behind, and you're right, we've not totally learned our lessons. We have the DMA, DSA directives coming from the European Commission, I think are good steps forward, and a very different way also in Europe to do things as in the US. There was a lot of backlash in the US against these two directives. I think they're a good step forward, but they're certainly not enough, and they're not enough in the face of more offensives that are going to come. As you said, in this super election year, we have European Parliament elections in June, and we're seeing right now a lot of criticism against climate policies coming from the far right, a lot of criticism against migrant policies, against immigration, which are probably going to be the two messages, climate and immigration, that will dominate the campaign. In the US, we're also seeing a lot of disinformation that's being spread, and so it's hard to fight against it. The EU has come out with this website called EU Disinfo Lab, where they actually provide people with some tools. So typically tools to check content that's coming on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, formerly Twitter, now X. They have special tools where you can check the data points that are being provided. But I think it's important for me to talk to you about them, and I'm hoping that people will check them out, but it's a minority of people who go on the websites and check it out. So I think there's also a real campaign for the EU to put forward in terms of diversifying this knowledge as much as possible, making citizens aware of the spread of disinformation, because I feel like it remains really an expert topic more than a public debate issue, which it really should be, because once again, coming back to what we were saying earlier, it is really our democratic infrastructures that are being put to risk, but being put to test. And things could unravel in a very negative manner fairly soon inside the European Union and outside the European Union too. So I think we need to take this very, very seriously.
Looking at the American perspective on this, we had also one date which was really pivotal to this, and this was 6th of January. And if we live in such unsecure times, when we talk again about with mistrust, security, sovereignty, these are like the big words, make this great again or make this close again. What can happen here? If, because both ways, or 3 or 4 ways, we see, not such an optimistic scenario.
I think a lot could happen. And when you see in polls, a lot of people are saying that they don't trust the mainstream media to get their information. So we're actually moving towards even more of an echo chamber phenomenon, where through social media, because of the algorithms, people are encouraged to follow other people who provide the same type of information or disinformation than they're already following, and they're surrounded virtually by people who think like them, and so you kind of get encouraged also in a very either positive or negative dynamic. I would say generally it's negative, because you need to have information that doesn't suit your worldview. You need to understand what different perspectives are from other countries or other people in your own country. Try to accept dissent, to understand that you have to live with these different perspectives, and you need to find a democratic way of having this conversation. What's happening right now is not moving in that direction at all, and you see a real polarization of elites in this country, maybe more polarized than the population itself, to be honest, but a real polarization of elites going mainly through social media. And you see this with Donald Trump. He's actually effectively left most of the social media platforms and or was asked to leave them, but he created his own and is using that media mainly to further his message. He's talking to his community, to his virtual community, through his own social media channel. I think there's a real risk there, because others could also be encouraged to move in that same direction. He's refusing to go on TV channels which he disagrees with. I think that sends also a fairly scary and really worrying message. he's not the first and he'll probably not be the last, but it's different when it's supposed to be the leader of the free world, the country that, you know, epitomizes really freedom of speech. When you think that the American president is, well, or former American president is doing that, and possibly the future American president, I think it sends a fairly terrifying message. And it might only get worse as we move towards the actual date of the election in November.
And you've mentioned this threat to democratic institutions. He basically was elected in 2016, was there with the slogan to drain the swamp, so basically to completely dismantle these institutions. And he built his agenda on something we've never, well, we've seen it in very dark times of our history, and this is conspiracy theories. So when you talk about our global security in this kind of political environment, as politics is basically influencing everything, what's your assessment? How can we solve either Ukraine or Middle East with these kind of super tension when I think first time in modern history no one talks to anyone?
I don't know if it's no one talks to anyone, or actually you have to talk to a lot more people than you used to. And I think that's also the main difference. You see with the rise of what we call the global south, actually actors, I don't want to say emerging because I think they've always been there. It's just that their voice now is being heard in a way that it wasn't. And they are right to make their voices heard. But this means that actually for the West, for the US, for Europe, a lot more energy needs to be put in diplomatic efforts in trying to understand the voices that come from elsewhere in the world, what their perspectives are. And yes, try to bring them on board, because I do think that there are actually a lot of things that bring us together, a lot of principles more than values. International law principles that bring us together. I was on a panel at a conference in India a few weeks ago, and it's interesting. One of the panelists, a European, said, "Well, you know, I think the international system is broken," and the Indian foreign minister said, "I don't think it's broken, but it could be improved." And actually, we probably shouldn't say it's broken, because there are many things about it that are not working. But it is in our interest, in all of our interest, to make it work, to make it improve, to actually put energy in making it better, because yes, it's not perfect, but it's the best that we have for the time being. And I think that's important too. Everyone has a stake in making this better, but we ourselves need to be more democratic about how we do foreign policy, try to understand different perspectives, be mindful that the world has changed. Yes, it's not the world of the end of the Cold War. It has fundamentally changed. It's not bipolar or unipolar anymore. I don't know if it's multipolar, but it's certainly a lot more complex. And that will be a bit of a struggle for us, but I'm hopeful that if we manage to bring everyone on board and make the case for democratic infrastructure that works, that we will get through together and we'll see a profoundly changed global environment. What is certain is that neither Russia nor China wants this. And they are also being very clear about it. So I think we should ourselves be very clear about what we want, be firm in our principles, be able to reach out to a variety of categories of country and not ask them to choose. I don't think that's helpful. We shouldn't say it's us against them. This is very much what Russia and China do, but we need to do things differently. We need to say, we understand your interest. We also think it's in your interest to make sure that this international system is protected. And it will only be protected if we can trust the information that we get, if we can trust the people who are in charge, the people that we've democratically elected. And we need to protect this. And I feel like protect is also not a strong enough word, because it feels very inward looking. We need to make sure that this democratic infrastructure is also competitive and energetic and innovative and forward looking, not just inward looking in terms of protecting this. Because it is true that people get their information, and especially young people, in a very different way than they used to 20 years ago. They are not getting it. They're actually curious. They want different perspectives. They want TikTokers, they want YouTubers, they want people to tell them about the world that they're living in a very different way that, the written press or traditional media does it. It doesn't mean that it's going to destroy completely, but it means that you need to be able to address these people. They're actually the young generation right now is the one that is getting the most information that any of them had in the past 70 to 100 years. They're confronted on a daily basis to news coming from Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia, from Croatia, from Serbia, from France. they have all of this in the way that their predecessors really didn't. I think you also need to understand it's kind of overwhelming. So how do you learn how to process this information? How do you analyze it? How do you make sure that you yourself are building concerned citizens, intelligent citizens, mindful citizens, human citizens of the future? I think that's really, really important. And that is something that you do in the mid to long term. It's very hard for democratic institutions to see the immediate return on investment for them. And that's also what our rivals and adversaries are counting on. They are doing very short, incisive, very efficient disinformation campaigns that we struggle to respond to. But I think what we are looking at is building these democratic infrastructures and solidifying them, consolidating them in the mid to long term. And so we also have a bit of a discrepancy with our rivals there, that they are working in the immediate short term, foreign interference, election interference, disinformation campaigns in the immediate moment, which have massive consequences, political consequences for us. And we are more looking at something that's in a different time frame, but which is very important too. And I think where we struggle is the short-term response. And we haven't found an answer to that yet.
You first made me cry, and then you made, it's fantastic. I'm so, how to say, happy when I meet people who think like you. So thank you. So this will not be part of the interview, but it's fantastic to get on the Russia thing, because it's acute at the moment because of what you said. They act short term. They have the system that is capable of doing that. They don't have, checks and controls and democratic surveillance or whatever. How much of a long-term problem for us can their short-term actions now do? Because you've mentioned youth. I am looking, I don't know what's happening in the US, but I was doing a project on youth in the last year, and it's a huge influence through TikToks and through all these channels that you've mentioned. They're really creating such intelligent narratives. They're building whatever you want, influencers, stories, riding the bear, whatever. So this is the next generation of our democracies. Plus, they are playing, when we talk about value system, they're playing with legitimate grievances of our history, which is colonialism, which is everything that, it's in the Putin's playbook, plus this modern openness societies, these new words which I hate, but he's perfect on about this woke, cancel, blah. What can be done if you have politicians that are basically playing the same song, from Trump to whatever, Le Pen to Wilders to whomever in Europe?
So the first thing that is being done right now is identifying how they work, because as I said, they're very efficient and incisive, but they do kind of replicate the same method every time. So there is a way for us to really understand how they work that will help us, I think, with the anticipation. But the fact of the matter is they can do a lot of damage because they are very targeted. They really look at the moments where we have elections. They do as much as they can to foster far-right, far-left populists and narratives. And they are looking at legitimate grievances, which they use very selectively. So they will never look at, of course, the whole argument, the contextualization, etc. They will pick one side of the argument and just hammer it down all the time. And I think they'll do it in a way that is very effective, and that we don't always have an answer to, because it is true that sometimes we are hypocritical and sometimes we have a double standard and we are not always fully coherent with our own policies. But I think we have a way of explaining that. I think it's our responsibility to make the more rational argument. It's just that it's less of it's a bit less appealing when you make it, when you make it online. It's kind of the rivalry between Trump and Biden in the US. Biden keeps saying, I'm the rational person, the sensible guy. I've been doing all these policies, economic policies, social policies for the past 3.5 years. I came in with a plan, an economic plan that is working. So you see all the rational argument that's being made, and I think which also is true. In the face of that, you have someone else who's haranguing, people in crowds at his rallies, saying things that are really incoherent and untrue most of the time. But looking at the space that social media has taken and the influence that social media can have, the person who looks a bit less rational somehow gets a lot more views, and it's very hard to fight against that. Doesn't mean that the rational person should give up. I think quite the contrary, because in the long run, I think that's what matters. The reality with social media is that also people have an attention span that is fairly short. You remember something at some point and then you move on to another issue. So it's really important for people who are consistent to remain consistent. But I do think that you need to appeal to the youth in a different manner to understand their preoccupations about climate, about their fears for the economy, about their fears for the future, the sense that there are there's more and more conflict in the world, more and more wars. There's a war in Europe right now. There's a war again in the Middle East. There could be a war between the US and China. There's of course the behavior of Russia, which is still extremely offensive and scary. And so you're looking at young people who have a very different perspective on the future, a very bleak perspective on the future, to be honest. At least I would say in Europe and in the US. I feel like if you talk to young people in Africa, in Asia, it's a different perspective too. But I think you need to understand that these fears that they have, which the Russians are stoking, they're real fears. And so it's also our responsibility in Europe and in the US to be able to acknowledge these fears, to talk to them about it, and to bring them into this perspective in the future, which I don't feel like we're doing enough right now.
And one more question concerning this global tension that we're living now. You mentioned social media or social networks as one part of a problem, basically, as we now see that the owner of one of the biggest is very much, ideological. He's not, Zuckerberg is not Elon Musk. Elon Musk is openly saying, we don't need journalism, this and that, migration, and he's really ideological. How, or can we at all bring back any kind of rationality in democracies and in people's decision-making, in a sense that we made this conspiracy like an ideology or like a religion, and people are acting towards that like it's something that is there, that is live, that is determining, QAnons and stuff. I cannot have any kind of mechanism in my head to understand what's going on.
I think the responsibility, I would say, particularly for democratic countries, is to have a macro vision, to have an understanding of the world, who can we work with, whom can we not work with, where our difficulties lie, but also to kind of implement it at the very micro level. What citizens say across the world is that they feel disconnected from their leaders, from their decision makers. Things happen in the capital. I would say that's particularly true for my country in France, which is really centralized, but in a way it happens also here. You travel inside the US and people will tell you they feel very disconnected from Washington, what happens in Washington, which is why Trump's sentence on drain the swamp has so much echo, because people say, well, how can someone in Washington understand what I'm living in Salt Lake City, in Utah, in California, in Texas, and here it's a federal state, so it's different. But I think making sure that as a political leader, you go and talk to everyone in your constituency, and even to people, probably even more so to people who disagree with you. Make this, I was going to say effort, it shouldn't be an effort. Take this moment to do it. Go and talk to people in person. People want to reconnect. They don't want to be inward looking. Maybe some want to be inward looking, but my sense is that's actually a minority, which is being very much vocal on social media, and there is also a sense of disconnect between this actually fairly small minority being very vocal and a lot of the silent majority who is increasingly being disengaged. And so politicians' responsibilities now are to go and talk to these people, but talk to them in person, not just through social media. Of course, you need to have a good social media messaging, but actually go out there, take the bus, take the train, take the plane, sit down with people, have a conversation with them about what their daily preoccupations are, but also why the US role in the world is important, why the European role in the world is important, why countries across the Middle East, across Africa, across Asia, across Latin America want to have a greater say, how that plays into their lives. And it does, because it does in terms of tariffs, in terms of imports, in terms of trade, in terms of migration. Actually, foreign policy has an impact on people's lives on a daily basis. And it is important for decision makers and political leaders to be able to say that and to hear people's preoccupations, but also tell them, actually, you know what? Because we have this deal with Mexico or Tanzania, you manage to get this and that good, much cheaper, better quality. You have engagement with the rest of the world. You're not inward looking, you're actually forward looking. And that is going to take up a lot of time, because politicians will tell you their agenda is already completely full. They have to be extremely careful of what they say now, because any video can become viral on social media. It could actually destroy, something that you say when you're really tired or not really thinking about an issue. You just say it out loud. You're in the market doing a visit, and then suddenly it totally upends your life. So now they're becoming, some of them, the rational ones are actually being extremely prudent. So they end up coming up with these videos or talks where they're very careful in terms of what they say, so they won't take a strong stance, so people feel even more disconnected, thinking, well, who is this person that I elected that I don't feel connected to? And so it's kind of a vicious circle, whereas the others, who might be a bit less rational, seem like, they're talking from their heart. I think that was really what was the most striking to me. I was looking at videos of Trump's first presidency, and he was connecting with people in a way, of course, that very few leaders were, because people were saying, actually, this person could be sitting at our dinner table, which I'm not sure they would say of Joe Biden. But Trump, they were saying, we feel connected to this guy, because he seems like us. He's not like them at all. He lives, in a place which has marble and gold actually everywhere. But he is managing to get across this image of the guy next door. I'm not saying every politician should get that, but a lot of the politicians should think about it in this way, be able to have a real connection with their constituency, have real discussions, make sure that they know that they're accountable to the people. And that is what is going to work, but that's also a huge effort to make, a lot of energy that's put into that. Again, that you don't see the return on your investment immediately on, but I think you do see it in the long run, where people say, well, I elected this person and they were there for me. They were there for the country and they were there for me. And I think that's going to be one of the major issues. And you want to believe, if someone comes to you in person at some point and says, we see all these reports, they're actually fake reports. They're coming from a variety of our adversaries who are really looking at targeting us. But I will tell you and give you figures in a simple and intelligible way. I think that is what is going to make a huge difference. And people remember that, because if you have a personal connection, a personal experience, a personal moment with your representative, that's fairly incredible. This is something that people do remember.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thanks a lot.